Leighton Flowers and James White had a debate on whether John 6 proves the Calvinist doctrine of unconditional election. In the debate, James White was pressing Leighton for evidence, and James White ended the discussion by saying,
"Nice cover for not being able to answer the question, but I'm done."
Does Leighton ever answer this question? Why are people calling each other dishonest?
It's not intellectually honest.
Let's talk about it here. Let's go over some quick thoughts before we begin. I think both Leighton Flowers and James White both made some good arguments and some really poor arguments for their views. We'll discuss that a bit today, but make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our extensive debate review with a biblical scholar in the coming days. Until then, let's dive into the debate and point out something that really stood out to me. It starts with John 6:4, where a group of rowdy people come to Jesus saying, "Ain't you from some small town, Jesus? How you say you from heaven?" Jesus replied, "Do not complain about me to one another. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up at the last day." James White thinks that Jesus in John 6:44 was saying no one can accept Christ unless God draws him first. That this drawing is not based on any merit or foreseen faith in the individual, but is an expression of God's sovereign will. Those whom God chooses for salvation are drawn to Christ by the Father, irrespective of their own efforts or abilities. Leighton thinks this drawing is the teaching given by God that the Israelites had the ability to choose to believe or not believe the teaching. Next, Jesus says to the rowdy group, "It is written in the prophets, and they will all be taught by God. Everyone who hears and learns from the Father comes to me."
The word God in verse 45, "They shall be taught by God." You believe that that action is to all of Israel.
Yes, just like in Romans 10, have they not all heard? And he says, yes, my message has gone out to the ends of the earth. They have all heard. They don't have an excuse.
But it's not effective because the majority don't learn.
A remnant do listen and learn and believe, and therefore he reserves them. They're the lost sheep of Israel, and those are the ones he's going to bring to his sons.
You are introducing a distinction between Pontus and Pos when there's only two words in between them, because you seem to be saying everyone hearing from the Father is different than all who are taught by God.
I just don't assume, by a presupposition like you do, that people who hear a message automatically have to believe it. I believe that some people can hear a message and choose not to believe it. I believe they can close their ears and their eyes to it.
White says he's pointing to the Greek words, pantes and pas, or in English, all, as in all will be taught of God, and everyone, as in everyone who hears and learns from the Father comes to me. White asks if it's a parlor trick to ask for what evidence Leighton has for seeing the all and everyone as two different groups of people.
So when I point to the words Pontus and Pos, and you create a distinction, is it a parlor trick on my part to ask you to substantiate that assertion?
The funny thing is that White doesn't give the English translations, which is why I think Leighton gives this odd response.
Again, I can read from you exegetes who know just as much Greek as you do, Dr. White, who do not interpret this text to mean that people are just passive in hearing and learning because he's only talking about the unconditionally elected people in eternity past. You understand it that way because you have your presuppositions.
Leighton essentially responds by saying, there are lots of Greek experts that don't agree with your position. Like, okay, but you didn't give evidence for your position. And why didn't he? Why did he mention this random bit about Greek experts that don't agree? I could be wrong, but I think he realized he needed to give a quick answer, but didn't know what the words pontes and pos mean, and therefore interpreted that White was giving an argument based on the usage in the Greek. Because he interpreted it as, I'm making an argument from the Greek, he responded with, I have Greek scholars on my side too. Which is funny to me personally because this isn't a disagreement about what the grammar of Greek is conveying. There's nothing special in the Greek that gives this answer of whether the all or the everyone respond to the same thing. White was just saying the English words for all and everyone, pas and pantes in Greek, if I were to guess, which was an attempt to sound smart to gain points with his audience. Of course, even if Leighton has his Greek experts who take his position, simply having smart people who agree with you doesn't make your position right. There's a super biased scholar on all sides of the debate. You can't just simply trust people. You won't know if they are biased unless you understand their arguments. If one's interpretation relies on an understanding of the Greek, I think it is Leighton's responsibility to learn the Greek instead of just trusting other people.
I am talking to you about the grammar of the text. I'm not talking about my presuppositions. I'm not talking about Manichaeanism or any of that insanity. I'm talking about what the text says, and the text is coherent in saying that all are taught by God, everyone hearing. You distinguish. I'm asking you, give us an argument that's not about my alleged presuppositions or somebody who's not here.
You're the one who brought up the
Show
presuppositions.
me where from the text you make the distinction that is absolutely necessary for your position.
And they will all be taught of God. That means that every one of them have no excuse because they have heard what they need to hear. Everyone has been taught of God. Everyone who hears from the Father and learns comes to me. Not everyone who is taught will listen and learn. Some of them will close their eyes.
I know you're
I don't know how that can be more clear, Dr.
I
White.
know you're making the distinction, but it is painfully clear to those of us
It's
that are
so
looking
clear that you're the first one to be able to interpret that way. I mean, it's not so clear if obviously a lot of people interpret differently than you who also know Greek, Dr. White.
You just said that if these are actually descriptions of the effective actions of God, that the debate is over, that my understanding is correct. And I'm simply asking you, it is fundamentally necessary for you, if you're going to deal with the text, for you to be able to explain why the scriptural citation from either Isaiah 54 or Jeremiah 31, Pontes didaktoi theou, is different than pas ha akusas para tu patras. You have to explain why you're making that distinction from the text, or just admit, I don't know, and it's presuppositional, and we're done with it.
James White is saying, I know you make the distinction, it is painfully clear. And then Leighton interrupts him, saying, it's so painfully clear that you're the first to interpret that way. There are people who interpret it different that know Greek. In a later video after the debate, Leighton said,
But he might say, I lean this way, or I think this because of this thing, or this point, or that point. That's being intellectually honest. And Greek scholars do that all the time. What's not intellectually honest is jumping in, like Dr. White says, it's painfully obvious.
I know you're making the distinction, but it is painfully clear to those of us that are looking at...
It's so clear that you're the first one to be able to interpret that way. I mean, it's not so clear if obviously a lot of people interpret differently than you who also know Greek, Dr. White.
You just said...
Anyone and everyone who knows Greek knows that my theological commitment is taught by this grammar. And if you knew this grammar like I knew this grammar, then you would come to the same conclusion. And that is demonstrably false.
James White, of course, didn't say that because Leighton interrupted him. I'm sure that James White has said similar stuff before, but we can be confident that James White, at least in this discussion, was going to say that it's painfully clear that Leighton wasn't answering the question because James White asked the question like 5 times. I think Leighton was basically saying that we can't assume that just because the text says they were all taught of God means that all of those people will learn. This is true. We cannot simply assume it. Leighton thinks all of the people were taught, but the everyone refers to only the people that heard from the Father and learned. Coming from the after debate video we just watched, it seems like Leighton thinks White was making a grammatical argument based on the Greek. Why Leighton doesn't just ask what he thought the argument was so that he could understand it, I have no idea. It appears to be James White's argument that because similar words like all or everyone, two words commonly used to refer to all people of a group, are so close in ideas and also close in regards to this sentence, only two words separating them in Greek, that they must be referring to the same people. If I said, it is written in the rules of the organization, and they will be taught by the instructor. Everyone who hears and learns from the instructor is one of mine. In these sentences, due to the similar words of all and everyone, along with how hearing is literally required for someone to be taught, one could be justified in saying the same people who are taught are the same people who hear and learn. So James White is giving argument for why the all and everyone are in fact the same people. He's presenting evidence for his position, while Leighton appears to me to not see that it's an argument, which is why he says, I don't assume like you do. See, this is where it gets weird, because this is where it appears Leighton thinks he's giving some type of really complex Greek grammatical argument, but at the same time, he also responds by saying, I don't assume like you do. So clearly Leighton thinks that White isn't just assuming, like Leighton thinks he's making an argument, but then why would you ever say you're just assuming it? See, White doesn't assume this. He's making an argument from the words that are used, and not only does Leighton appear not to realize that, but Leighton doesn't give any indication from the text of John 6, which shows something from the way the words are used or the context of the passage or anything else that would give us evidence to think that the all who will be taught of God is different from the everyone who heard and listened. This, of course, isn't really based in the Greek. You can make the same argument from English. The next argument, of course, that we can make is James White's argument a good one? Not necessarily, but responding with,
I don't assume as you do.
is not a rebuttal to an argument. Leighton could have said something like, being taught isn't the same as listening and learning. He could have pointed to something in the passage which showed they were two different groups. He could have pointed to other uses of these words in the same context of how they are very different things. I would assume Leighton didn't just come to that conclusion because he thought that was the only way White's argument fails. Like, surely he has some evidence for reading the text that way, right? After pressing Leighton 3 or 4 times, Leighton starts to get emotional.
Again, I don't assume, as you do, that just because someone is taught, that they will necessarily, therefore, listen and learn. I believe that if a student is in a classroom and they don't learn, it's not because the teacher doesn't really want them to learn, or because the teacher has some hidden agenda, or a secret hidden agenda, where two wills of the teacher. I think the teacher actually says, when I want you to hear and learn and listen, I really want you to hear and learn and listen. And when I hold out my hands to you all day long, he actually wants them to come. That's what I believe. Clear enough?
Nice cover for not being able to answer the question, but I'm done.
Was Leighton getting frustrated with himself? Was he afraid of being embarrassed for not feeling like he could answer the question? Was he just heartbroken for all of the people who he thinks suffer because of views like this? Impossible to tell. Either way, in this clip, Leighton doesn't give any evidence from the text of John 6, which explains why we should take his view. Now, it's worth pointing out that Leighton is giving a more practical, evidential argument at the end for why he rejects White's view, but that doesn't give us any evidence for why we should hold Leighton's interpretation of John 6:45. If we are talking about how to win a debate, well, you prove your position right, which is that John 6 doesn't teach unconditional election. So did Leighton give evidence for his position? Sure. James White needs a sufficient answer for his view that God says he wants to save people, but appears to not want to. With that being said, does Leighton give evidence for why we should take his specific position of John 6 in this clip? No. If one is to make a convincing case for a passage, it's essential to be able to give evidence for your interpretation from something in the immediate context. Otherwise, a lack of evidence to accept such a view could be an indication that we should reject it. In other words, possible doesn't equal probable. So what should we learn about this? 1, make sure you have thorough explanation for why you take a view you do. Obviously, don't call people intellectually dishonest for things they never said. If you're emotional about something, you should probably take a step back and think about it. It's okay to say you don't understand the question or the argument. If you spend an infinite amount of hours on a topic and are teaching thousands of people, you should probably make sure you know at least the relevant Greek for the important passages. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on my extensive debate review with a mystery biblical scholar here.